Hello and welcome to the 6th episode of The Great Debate, a 10-part webinar series where two guests debate whether a cybersecurity topic should be the top priority right now. Before we get to today's debate, a few operational items. First, today's session is being recorded and we'll send a link to the recording shortly after the webinar wraps up. Next, there are several opportunities for today's guests to cover audience questions. You can add your question using either the chat or the question panel within GoToWebinar. You'll also notice a poll appear right now asking you whether you're in favor or opposed to this statement. Phishing protection is the #1 cybersecurity priority right now. We'll tally the results and we'll ask again at the end to see if either of our guests changed your mind about the topic. Finally, we'll be making a $500 donation to each of today's speakers to a charity of their choice. And with that, I'm going to share the poll results and hand it off to our moderator, Axonius CMO, Nathan Burke, to get started.
Would you look at that? 50-50. I don't think we've ever had that before. All right.
Not.
All right, this is going to be interesting. All right, thanks, Anna. All right, so today's topic is, should phishing protection be the #1 priority right now? Not just phishing, because that would be a different topic. So our first guest taking the in favor position is Katie Teitler. She is senior analyst at Tag Cyber, where she collaborates with security organizations on market messaging, positioning, and strategy. In previous roles, she has managed, written, and published content for 2 research firms, a cybersecurity events company, and a security software vendor. So Katie, please tell our audience the charity that you are supporting today.
Well, I'm supporting Broken Tail Rescue. Thank you so much, Nate and Axonius team, for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this. Should be fun. But Broken Tail Rescue is my charity. I'm a huge animal advocate, and the reason I chose Broken Tail is because last Friday, just this past Friday, I adopted a dog from them, and hopefully she won't make her presence known on this webinar, but to everybody watching and listening, if she does, she just wants to be part of it too.
All right, great. Thank you again for joining us, Katie. And taking the opposing position on phishing protection today is Ryan Fritz, VP of Technology and Product Security and CISO at ADT. His current role at ADT is primarily focused on responsibility for product security. He works with the product teams on the electronic digital security side and the physical security side of the products as well, doing product evaluations and managing a lab that does their own internal penetration testing for products. Also, he's responsible for technology in the company's emerging cybersecurity offering. Prior to joining ADT, he worked at Stanley Security for 7 years and a sales operation hybrid IT role. Ryan, thanks for joining us, and please tell us about your charity.
Yes, thanks, Nathan. Thanks, Axonius. Thanks to Katie for joining. My charity is the Bail Project. It's a nonprofit organization designed to combat the money bail system that creates, a system of injustice for those who cannot afford to pay bail. They will pay the bail on their behalf. There are, hundreds of thousands of people in jail right now waiting trial, and the only reason they are in jail is because they cannot afford to pay bail, effectively criminalizing poverty. So they do a fantastic work in terms of social support and getting them back out. If you think about what that means, if you're stuck in jail and can't pay bail, it puts your livelihood on the line for your job, your house, your child, children. So they do a fantastic job, a fantastic charity.
All right, excellent. Thank you for joining us today, Ryan. So today's topic is phishing protection, and to give a bit of context on the topic, let me hand it off to Noah Simon, who is the Director of Product Marketing here at Axonius. So Noah, take it away.
All right, thank you, Nate. So phishing is still the most common attack vector, and according to the 2020 Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, 22% of breaches involved social engineering, and nearly all of those social engineering breaches occurred via email. During today's debate, phishing will refer broadly to social engineering attacks that leverage email, text, or telephone to obtain credentials, as well as malicious or insecure websites that trick people into entering credentials. We'll also refer to phishing protection as a combination of tools and software, as well as user training given to help defend against phishing attacks. Phishing continues to evolve, and the following trends are what makes phishing hard to combat against today. The first is that impersonation and account takeover attacks have increased, which means anyone's identity is easy to impersonate or even compromise to carry out very targeted phishing attacks or even business email compromise. The second is that attacks occur beyond email. Attackers can now present fake login screens for collaboration platforms like Microsoft Teams or Slack or others in order to gain credentials that way. And the third is smishing, which is phishing attacks that occur via text messages, now delivers short, obfuscated links to users' smartphones. And because these are text messages and not email, they have much higher open rates than traditional email. So those are some of the trends we see with phishing today. And with that overview, I'll hand it back to you, Nate.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Noah. And now on to debate, and the format will be as follows. So each candidate will first have 2 minutes to make their opening statements. After opening statements, I'll then read 5 questions that each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer. We'll then go to final remarks, and we'll then open up the floor to questions from the audience. And this morning, I actually did this. I flipped a coin. And Katie, you will be going first. So you will have 2 minutes to make your opening statement on why phishing protection should be the top priority right now. And your time starts now.
Well, I think Noah made my argument for me, right? We've seen huge increases in phishing, and it's because it's not just email, it's not just text, it's not just websites, it's all of these avenues. And there are so many opportunities for attackers to exploit humans and humans' trusting nature and humans' behavior. But a few other specific points, like let's just take email. In business, we're on email all day long. According to a McKinsey report, 28% of our workday is spent reading and answering emails. So think about that. A third of your work life is spent answering email. So the volume of email that you get, and everybody's trying to be productive and efficient. And so answering these emails and sending emails, you get so used to it, you fall into a trap of just reply, send, respond, whatever the case may be. And the average worker gets 120 plus messages per day. That's just email. We're not even talking about your texts. We're not talking about the websites you use. So in aggregate, there's so much information coming at us. We're trying to be productive. And frankly, people are overworked, they're tired, they're stressed, and all of that contributes to maybe being fooled into thinking something is what it isn't, or not noticing tiny little details, because phishers have gotten savvy. The days of the Nigerian prince are gone. You know, nobody's coming at you asking you to send $1,000 in return for $1 million anymore. It doesn't happen. Those emails look like legitimate emails. Those websites look like legitimate websites, and it's really hard to know, especially when you're busy, when you're multitasking, when you're stressed. It's hard to know what to look for, and it's easy, very, very easy to be tricked by these phishers. And on top of that, part of our job and part of our life is it does involve going to websites and filling in forms and clicking on things. You can't do your job, you can't live in society without taking advantage of this technology. So that's number one. But beyond that, we have other challenges that come into it. Oh gosh, I hope I have enough time. So password management is a problem. We all know it. I won't get into the details here, but we know everybody watching is probably in security, so you know the issues with password management. Only 23% or so of users use a password manager, and that's probably mandated by their company for a lot of people. So the reuse issue is a problem. The lack of MFA issue is a problem, and all of these things facilitate attacks and attackers being able to get into accounts to find data, to find information, to make their campaigns against people more realistic. If somebody can get into some of my accounts, whether it's my email or my social media, they know more about me and they can create a campaign against me that talks about something that I really don't think a lot of people have information on. So many reasons why phishing should be the #1 priority. We'll get into it a little more. And I see Nate holding the clock, so I'm guessing I'm done.
All right. So Ryan, I'm going to let you, if you need a little more time, we went over by about 1.5 minutes on that. But we always make up for it. Don't worry about it. We are not as strict as some debate commissions. So with that said, let me hand it over to you, Ryan, for your 2 or 3.5 minutes.
All right, you're not going to mute my mic at 2 minutes. I feel good about that. So thanks. What I would say is phishing obviously is an initial access vector. Can be a lateral movement vector as well. I feel like Katie kind of helped make my case there at the end a little bit, that the lack of multi-factor, the lack of strong or robust identity and access management controls helps precipitate compromises. And social engineering has been around as long as speech has been around. Where there is someone who is vulnerable to social engineering, you're going to have people trying to take advantage. And to some extent, it can be very hard, and unless you can get 100% in terms of stopping social engineering attacks via multiple vectors. And new ones are rising all the time, especially with the rise of Slack and Teams and Zoom. You have new avenues you have to protect and vectors to protect. And if you're not focused on the rest of the stack, right? If that social engineering avenue is the way in the door, then it speaks to not having enough landmines on the battlefield. And you have to be focused on those other controls, such that phishing doesn't become your #1 priority. And if you've got a strong and robust identity and access management framework, if you've got strong processes and process management in place, then the result is phishing can become less of a priority because you have strong endpoint controls. Malware can be mitigated. If you have strong identity and access management controls, that account takeover and impersonation can be mitigated. And if you're able to mitigate the downstream impacts of phishing, is phishing really the #1 threat? And with that, I will yield my time.
All right, excellent. So now on to the questions. So remember, each guest will have 2 minutes to answer the following questions. And I will just put out a quick plug. We will get to audience questions at the end. So as we go along, feel free to add your questions either through the question functionality or the chat within GoToWebinar, and we'll get to those at the end. So be sure to add them there. All right, so here is question 1. So as Noah said in the beginning, and we've covered a little bit here, that phishing still remains the most common attack vector today, and employees continue to click on malicious emails, and that can lead to data loss, ransomware, business email compromise. So the first question here is phishing inherently a people problem, a process problem, or a technology problem? And we will begin with you, Ryan, starting now.
All right. I mean, I would say fundamentally, phishing's got to be a people problem. It's social engineering. It takes advantage of a sense of urgency, confidence, and trust. And where it is successful is a breakdown in process and technology. Either you didn't have the technology to stop it, or your processes aren't robust enough to mitigate against the impact. So, cache management, do you have, voice verification, for opening and handling data and information? Do you have the rigor of a process to support identification of improper requests, which effectively are going to be the social engineering side of the equation? I mean, it's at its core taking advantage of people and projecting the confidence. It is a con game, but it's fundamentally a people problem. Where it's most successful, or where you have process and technology issues downstream. And with that, I'll leave my time.
All right, and Katie, over to you.
Well, thank you, Ryan. I'm going to use some of your points too, like any good debater would. I'd say it's all of the above. People, process, and technology. It can't be an either or. So people may be the first line of defense, and attackers will always take advantage of people. And certainly awareness of phishing has come a long way since I started in security years ago. But phishing isn't an awareness problem in and of itself. It's a habit problem. It's a behavior problem. And no matter how good and how thorough security awareness and training programs are, the way we run business runs counter to a lot of the so-called best practices. So we can tell people, don't click on links, don't open attachments, double check the URL of a website you're visiting. But we can't just rely on people. We need that rigor of the process. And we need to look at technology as being that layered defense and processes put in place to be a layered defense. We need phishing protection. We need DMARC. We need email gateways. We need content protection for users' mailboxes. We need to protect data at rest as well as in transit. So it's not okay anymore to just think we can stop the bad actors from using people as their ingress. We need to have a layered defense and deploy technology to prevent attackers when they do get into people's inboxes. We need to prevent it from going any further, to stop the propagation of an attack, to stop lateral movement. And the way to do that is with a layered defense: people, process, and technology.
Okay. All right, on to question number 2. Employees are now more distributed than ever, and more people are working from home instead of the office. So does that mean that companies should prioritize phishing protection even more now? And we'll start with you, Katie.
100%. When companies moved to work from home, they had to accept a lot of things. They had to accept that people might be working over insecure Wi-Fi connections. They had to accept that some employees would not be on managed devices. People were using their personal devices because they didn't have any choice. Companies, unfortunately, were not necessarily prepared for it. And with remote work, with work from home, with more data and systems in the cloud, without being able to go and talk to your coworker and say, hey, Joan, tell me about this, that, or the other thing. We need to use systems. We need to use our technology to communicate, which means that more information is available if attackers get to it. It means that the volume of increase, I heard one statistic that said the volume of email increased with work from home 95%. Think about that. You have more email, everybody's tired, everybody's stressed, you don't know what's going on. So just looking at what people have to do to function at home and some of the insecurity that started when people work from home opens up a lot of vector for attack. And enterprises are telling us that their main security concerns are around keeping people productive and efficient. And security, as it always does, unfortunately, lagged a little bit behind. So how do they get their people to be secure on their own devices? That might be shared in the home with their kids who might click on something or might visit a site that they maybe shouldn't and open up another vector. Secure remote connectivity is a problem too. VPNs, super prevalent, and companies were scrambling to put them in place, but we all know the pros and cons of VPNs. If a remote employee clicks on an infected link, an attacker can snoop on a connection before the VPN encrypts traffic. Again, just gathering that data, using anything that they can to then send out a phishing campaign and exploit the employee.
Okay, Ryan, over to you.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna pull from Katie on the VPN and say, VPNs are an important part, right? The network security component, identity and access control. Particularly with VPNs, you expose that endpoint back to the corporate network. But that speaks more to other control weaknesses, things like network security, endpoint protection, identity and access management, and not to phishing itself on the front end and the social engineering component. At some level, we have to accept that we're not going to be 100% effective at prevention. And when you're not 100% effective at prevention, all of those other controls become all the more important. I think the harder part, maybe a secondary to this, is that it assumes that threats come exclusively from outside in, and ignores that, you know, employees are also the source of compromise directly, either via negligence or you know, compromise malicious activity. But from some perspective, there has to be an acknowledgement that insider threat exists. And again, it speaks to controls you have on data management, endpoint protection, network. You know, the ability to detect activity becomes more and more important. As soon as you say that you can't stop 100%, you need to have the internal control matrices to be able to detect the activity and respond. And
okay. All right, so on to, I think, my favorite question of the series, which is why we ask it in every single one of these. So as a CISO, or if you're advising a CISO, if you were given one additional headcount and $1 million to dedicate to phishing protection, where would you start? So for the in favor candidate, where would you start specifically as it relates to phishing protection? For the opposition candidate, what would you prioritize instead? And Ryan, we start with you.
Where I would start instead is probably twofold. I'd start on vulnerability management in particular. It's the one area that's 100% within your control to affect. You know, you can't control how many phishing emails you receive. You can't control how many external attacks you get, but you can 100% control the size and scope of vulnerabilities within the environment. It's the one lever you can continuously pull. After that, it would probably be identity and access management. You know, how effective can you build multi-factor auth, conditional, behavioral, and context aware. So starting to get into zero trust to be able to secure identities and systems against unauthorized access. Those would be my two areas. So I guess I get the benefit of providing two options.
Okay. All right, and over to you, Katie.
Training is obviously important when it comes to phishing, but it's not the be all and end all for the reasons that I've mentioned. And normal business operations require some of the actions that would prevent a lot of phishing, like opening email attachments and clicking on links. So there's only so much that we can do in terms of awareness. So I would say we need to spend a good portion of the money on tools and technologies that prevent attempts from getting through, to prevent that lateral movement. And I agree with Ryan. I'm going to concede a little here that access controls are really important. So I don't want to give too much away. I'm here to win. But the fact of the matter is we need technology, because you're not going to, quote, fix people, because there actually isn't a problem with people. And we need that layered defense, and we need to implement some of the things that companies have either lagged doing. We need better anti-phishing. We need better inventory of what systems are being used to connect to our networks, to connect to our clouds, to know where people are getting access so that we can put the right controls in place to prevent the phish from happening, or looking at the phish as the facilitator of a deeper attack, because that is going to happen. We can't prevent phishing entirely, unfortunately, but we need the technology in place and not just rely on the, quote, human is the weakest link, because A, it's not true, B, it's derogatory, and C, we've got processes and technologies to help with it.
All right. So on to our fourth question. So a strong understanding of your employees' user accounts and security level can help identify which users are highest risk for phishing attacks. but many teams can't even understand all the user accounts they have, the risk level, which leads me to ask, if you were dead set on prioritizing phishing protection, what are the absolute foundational challenges you need to solve just to get started? And so I will start with you, Katie.
Foundational challenges, password management, MFA, understanding where people have their access, through what devices, how they're being used, when they're being used, if they're being shared. How many employees do you have? What accounts do they use? Is it just their business account or is it their personal accounts? I think we're probably all guilty of using multiple accounts just either to make it easier or by accident. We use a personal account for things maybe we shouldn't. When it comes to partners and contractors and how they are managed, we have to look at ways to protect all of the email accounts of the employees. And it's really, really hard to do so because you can't say to an employee, you can't use X email account, or you can't use X password on your personal account. You can't force a human being for their non-work life to use work tools or business tools. But we need to have that understanding of what people are using, how they're using it, how they're working, so that we can put the right controls in place. I work with one company that offers an anti-phishing solution, and it's focused on email accounts, and they offer to all of their customers protection for their VIPs, their executives or board members, personal accounts. It's like a benefit, like we get health insurance, or some people get free dry cleaning or discounts on gym memberships. So there are ways we can go about it, but it's definitely hard when your human is both an employee and an individual who does things outside of work.
All right, Ryan, same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I feel like Katie's helping make my case, saying, you know, identity and access management is the thing to prioritize. You know, if I were to step back and try to be the contrarian here to my own point, you know, I think foundationally you have to understand the nature and intent of that outside actor, right? So if they're targeting the accounts payable team, you know, they're going to be invoice fraud, you know, accounts receivable, same deal. HR is going to be, you know, resumes that are malicious, you know, executing macro code in the background, probably PowerShell. So, you know, it's the how do you get granular on the types of attacks that different groups are going to see, and work with them on what controls can we put in place procedure-wise to manage those. So for like invoice fraud, you know, changes to payment requests. Can you do voice verification, right? Independent verification based on contacts on file. Salespeople are going to get requests for you know, assets and inventory that are fraudulent in nature, want them shipped with paid for with fraudulent credit cards. So there are a number of attacks throughout the organization on which social engineering will be the basis. And it's about trying to understand the attacks that those various groups are going to see and try to contextualize, you know, and build awareness into those groups based on what they're likely to see. That's, in my mind, the best you can do to solve the phishing side of the equation.
All right. So on to question 5. So the title of this whole session was, should phishing protection be the #1 priority right now? But I think we'd all agree that the answer needs to be a bit more nuanced than yes or no. And so the final question before we hand it over to audience questions, and feel free to add them in the question or the chat here, is this. So what kinds of organizations should prioritize phishing protection right now? And conversely, what types of organizations or security teams should focus on other things? And we will start with you, Ryan.
Yeah, I would say if you've got weak identity and access management controls, endpoint protection controls, if you are more laissez-faire, then to some extent you should prioritize phishing. You can control the ingest. I would say you should probably think about all of the other controls downstream first. But if you cannot move those organizational pieces relative to identity and access management, if there are big gates that you cannot open, at that point you have to prioritize phishing to mitigate the ingest, to mitigate the start of the life cycle. But it doesn't mean I believe that should be the first thing that's prioritized. But if you can't move those other factors, this would be where I'd say to prioritize. And I would tell everybody that identity and vulnerability, and go back in a stump speech, should be the things that they're really focused on.
Okay. And same question to you, Katie.
I would say if you're thinking linearly, the endpoint is always a starting point, right? The endpoint, it's the biggest initial attack vector. Noah rattled off some stats from the Dibber. So we know these things, these attacks start at the endpoint, and they start with phishing. It's the easiest thing to do, and it's the most reliable thing for attackers, which is the argument for phishing protection, right? It's the argument to stop things before they start. I will concede that this is nuanced, and I'm here to win this debate, and Ryan's really good, so I don't want to give up too much, but it is obviously nuanced. But if my argument is for phishing protection, then we have to start where the attacks start, and that is through phishing. That said, what types of organizations focus on other things? Well, my boss used to run the security program at AT&T, and his mandate as the CISO was to keep systems up and running. There could be no downtime, there could be no disruption, because the company would lose millions of dollars anytime subscribers lost connectivity. So his mandate as a chief security officer wasn't necessarily to keep things secure above all else, it was to keep availability. So you need to know your business. So which types of other organizations should focus on other things? Those where the business mandate is something other than security, right? And oh, I shouldn't have said that. That's a bad one. No, take that back. Can I rewind my words? But like for AT&T or for a hospital with medical devices, you have to look at what's happening. Are you going to be threatening a life if your connectivity goes down? Are you a power plant and millions of customers would lose access to their electricity? So you need to prioritize where you put your protection. But again, going back without the rewind, phishing is the initial attack vector. So that should be prioritized to prevent as much as you can before an attack gets going.
Okay, great. So that is the conclusion of the main question section. So before we let each guest give their final remarks and then open it up for the audience questions, Anna, let's poll the audience one more time.
Absolutely. And as a reminder, it was 50-50 the first time we polled the audience. And here are the results.
Okay, so we moved to 75% opposed. So we went from 50-50 to now more opposed than in favor. All right. So now we move on to the 2-minute final remarks, and we start with you, Ryan, now.
Thanks. I just want to take a minor victory lap and then, comment that, what Katie indicated in the last section on, breaches or incidents being the source of endpoint. If you look at recent Ponemon study results, the vast majority of breaches now occur via misconfiguration, cloud misconfigurations, and server-based attacks. So, it's not just the endpoint. It gets back to the vulnerability, configuration, the hygiene at the base, and then operations and security. And in my mind, from an operations and security perspective, for me, those are one and the same. From a business continuity perspective, an incident, whether it's a natural disaster or a cybersecurity attack, is fundamentally irrelevant. It creates an outage and liability event for the organization. And you can be focused on operational availability without the sacrifice of security. And what I view is, can you control the things that are in your power to control? Again, vulnerability management, configuration, baseline hygiene, identity and access management policies. If you can control well for the things that are within your power, it helps mitigate against things that are outside of your availability to control. The number of phishing emails you get, the amount of training, the headcount turnover, expertise in the area. If you can hit the foundational items well, the other items tend to take care of themselves more easily.
All right, and there we go. Katie, your 2 minutes for final remarks.
Hats off to you, Brian, and I'm glad my job isn't as a debater. But I'll counter you with some stats of my own. Actually, they're not mine, they're proof points. So more than 9 million suspicious emails were reported by Proofpoint users in the last year. That's only one anti-phishing company. In 2019, 90% of organizations experienced targeted phishing attacks. 88% of organizations said they faced spear phishing attacks. 86% dealt with business email compromise attacks. We have the anti-phishing working group and some stats for them. In Q3 2019, they detected almost 267,000 phishing sites. So now we're moving from email to sites, which is up 46% from the previous quarter and nearly doubled the number of attacks detected in Q4 2018. So it shows that phishing is a problem, a major problem. It's only increasing, especially with work from home, with email volumes going up, with people being online more than ever before, with people receiving so many more messages. Phishing is always going to be the entry point. And yep, I've said it, I agree there should be a layered approach, but if you want to stop the bulk of bad, do it at the first place that attackers are going to look. And that's why phishing, anti-phishing campaigns, technology, people, process should be prioritized, because the more you can knock out up front, the less you're going to have to deal with on the inside.
All right. So Noah, let me hand it over to you. I see a couple of audience questions. Where do you want to start?
Excellent. Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Ryan. We have a few great questions that came in. I'll start with this first one, which might extend even beyond the realm of security, but it's an interesting question nonetheless. Recent studies have shown that email is a huge time and productivity waste to the business. Are we putting too much focus on phishing and not addressing the real problem, which is the scourge known as email?
All right, so I think Ryan, we start with you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll jump into this hand grenade. I tend to interact a lot more with Teams these days. Teams, Slack, Zoom. I think we are shifting towards the era of collaboration and collaboration tools. You can get more immediate interactions, response, outcomes via that kind of live chat than via email. I do think email does have a part to play, particularly with intra-organizational conversations, at least for the foreseeable. I think that dynamic is certainly open. Social engineering will happen wherever people have conversations. So I don't think it really matters one way or the other. You need to think about that as an attack vector. I tend to think about the downstream controls, but as long as we've got collaboration, communication, you're going to have someone there to take advantage of it.
Okay.
So I worked for a short time in an organization that didn't believe in using email. They communicated with each other and with their customers only via Slack. And it was weird. I have to say it was really, really weird for me. Because I felt like some of the more important things that needed to be documented, that needed to be communicated, should be in a place where it was easy to find, where it was easy to categorize, where it was easy to pull up for later reference if you needed it. That said, I personally would love to decrease my reliance on email. Not entirely. I didn't like when I had one channel that had everything where it wasn't easy to find the important information I needed. But there's a lot of stuff communicated via email that doesn't necessarily need to be. It's people trying to be polite. It's people trying to over communicate. So you can't, I wouldn't fault anybody for that, but there is a lot of noise. And if you go back to one of the earlier stats, almost 30% of our day is taken up with email. That's crazy. That's a lot of time answering emails and taking your focus away from other work. That said, if we do use other collaboration channels, attackers will just move there. They already have, right? We're going to start seeing more attacks on these kind of channels for sure, because wherever the people are, that's where the attacks will go.
Excellent. We have another great question here that came in. What role do email standards such as DMARC play in combating phishing? And should companies be forced to adopt these standards? And if so, would that make a meaningful impact?
So we start with Katie on that one.
I don't know if forced is the right word, but I would definitely say that standards and technologies like DMARC should be used for sure. There's a problem in security that we have an abundance of tools that cover a piece of everything, and there's no holistic solution. I don't think it's realistic to expect the silver bullet, which is why we need a layered approach, which is why there are vendors coming up with new things. They're imagining and building different types of technologies all the time. That's why we have things like hype cycles. But yeah, I think companies do need to take that approach, that there are different aspects that cover their email security and protect that vector. For a while, security email gateways were the thing, right? And they do stop some low-hanging fruit, but we see tons and tons of attacks evading SEGs. We did a survey at Tag Cyber with our clients and found something like 73% of executives said that they saw phishing attacks evading SEGs daily. And that was multiple times a day for a lot of those people. So yeah, we definitely need to adopt the technologies that are out there and look for better solutions that aren't based, of course, on old technologies, old networks, old ways of access. But forced, I'm a little fixated on the forced. Should they be forced? No. Should it be best practice? Absolutely.
All right, Ryan, what do you think?
You've got attackers that, can get DMARC and DKIM pass, so it becomes a component, right? A component of a larger framework of trust. If you're putting all your eggs in DMARC and DKIM, it's not going to be a winning solution, primarily because, security programs across the board are uneven. So if somebody else who has DMARC and DKIM set up on their email servers, if one of their users gets compromised and another phishing campaign gets launched from there, it's going to have that, that air of trust. It's going to be backed by DMARC and DKIM. So, I would say if you made everybody do it, then the attackers who launch phishing campaigns will just go, sit on websites to get DMARC and DKIM certified and then launch campaigns anyway. It's a hard question to solve for based on the nature of how email works in the foundational email technologies. So it's a step in the right direction where it's enabled. You can gain a higher level of trust than when it's not. But if you made everybody do it, it's not going to stop. It's not going to stop the attacks. They'll just shift and get DMARC and DKIM certified mail servers and launch from there. So my perspective. N of one.
Okay. Noah, do we have any other questions?
Yeah, it looks like we have time for this one last question. What would you recommend for small and medium-sized businesses that may not have dedicated phishing protection resources? What are some of the basic steps they can take to reduce risks?
Is that one going to go to me?
Yeah, sorry. Yep, starts with you, Ryan.
All right. If I were to think about it, if you don't have resources, it's probably better to lean into a managed security provider. Would be my recommendation. And you should be asking them about how to augment and get identity and access management controls, particularly multi-factor. Be asking for vulnerability and configuration change controls. Lean into the things that you can control. Lean in on the education so you understand the various attack vectors and maybe the MITRE attack framework, and ask what they're doing and how they can help map and what your gaps are relative to maybe the MITRE attack, which would tell you what you need to focus on or where the gaps are and where you've got coverage, and then ask them to prove it.
I don't have much more to add because that's also my recommendation. Work with an MSP or an MSSP. Definitely lean on their expertise. There are, everybody knows the big ones out there, but there are tons of small regional players that do focus on SMBs, that do have services tailored for SMBs, and they understand they can't have the same subscription services as you would for a giant multinational enterprise. So definitely lean on those outside experts for help, and do all the things Ryan said.
All right. All right, Anna, over to you.
Great, thank you, Katie and Ryan. That concludes our debate. We'll be sending a link to the recording, and be sure to join us for the next episode of the Great Debate on November 17th, where Dan Greenhouse of ESSEC Training and Craig Taylor of CyberHoot will debate whether endpoint protection should be the top cybersecurity priority right now. This series is sponsored by Axonius, the cybersecurity asset management company that gives customers a comprehensive asset inventory, uncovers security gaps, and automatically validates and enforces policies. To try Axonius free for 30 days or to get a demo, go to axonius.com. Finally, we're excited to be making a donation to the Bail Project on behalf of Ryan Fritz, and a donation to Broken Tail Rescue on behalf of Katie Teitler. Thank you all for joining, and we look forward to seeing you soon.